Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, hopefully you're having an amazing day. A ton of additional details for Sony's GPU inside the PlayStation 5 Pro have emerged online, and what we're looking at basically is a 2x increase for both the L0 and L1 caches. The clock frequency is actually higher than those that were first reported, as well as a bunch of additional functionality on the GPU, such as mesh shader support, plus some other bits and pieces as well. Now, unfortunately, some of this video is going to get a little bit technical, so I'm going to give you guys kind of an overview of what some of this stuff may mean. I'll do a full deep dive when Sony finally announces the console, hopefully later this year. We'll also get a lot more details officially from Sony. Maybe they'll give us kind of a comparison versus the base model machine, but for now, let's just go into this, starting out with the basic configuration of the GPU. So we are looking at 30 work group processors. This now seems to be totally confirmed, and that means we're looking at 60 compute units. I'll go deeper into how this is split up with various shader arrays and shader engines in just a moment, but for now know that this is a hybrid design between RDNA 3. RDNA 3 is used for things like the work group processor, but RDNA 4 is pulled in for things like ray tracing. According to the official Sony documents, as we've covered previously, it's a 2 to 4 times increase depending on the workload. I won't cover that too much here because, again, it's been discussed a few times previously. Now, the GPU clock frequency seemed to have been 2.18 gigahertz. That was being reported. However, it can actually run up to 2.35, and this is depending on the power budget. So basically, this is not heat related. This is kind of like AMD's Smart Shift. Sony have somewhat incorporated this to the PS5 base model console as well. Smart Shift and what Sony have done is kind of a big topic, and I've discussed it previously, but basically speaking, the clock frequency varies based on the workload, and this can happen multiple times per frame of, not multiple times within 1 second. So, for example, if you're looking at like a 30 or a 60 FPS game, that clock frequency, it's not going to be the same over 1 second. You could have like 15 frames of the GPU running at like, I don't know, 2.18 gigahertz, and the rest of the frames could be running at the full speed or what have you. Again, it's going to be very much dependent on the workload, the game, what's happening on screen, what the developers are doing on the CPU, and so on. So what about the cache structure? Well, the documents that Eurogamer have gotten access to indicate that we're looking at 4 megabytes of L2 cache. This is the exact same as the base model console. L1 is 256 kilobytes versus 128 kilobytes of the base model console. Meanwhile, L0 is also 2 times, so that's 32 kilobytes versus, as you'll probably guess, given its 2x increase, 16 kilobytes of the base model console. To put that into some level of context, that's pretty much similar to what you would expect from a similarly equipped RDNA 3 GPU, as you can see on screen. The difference is with a GPU like, for example, the 7800 XT, I got there in the end, that would also incorporate Infinity Cache, which, as far as we know right now anyway, the PS5 Pro does not feature, and also it seems that the 7800 XT, for example, would have additional memory bandwidth thanks to the GPU essentially running its memory at faster clock frequencies. Now, obviously, we are discussing a console that has not been released, so it's possible that, on the final production consoles, Sony may make some specification change. No, that is not a hint, and no, that is not a leak. I'm just simply saying, until this stuff is finalized, until there is official confirmation, stuff can change. But at the moment, anyway, it seems that it's going to be very interesting, basically, to see how memory bandwidth affects this console. Ultimately, I think Sony are not dumb. There's probably a lot of stuff that they've done on the GPU, and a lot of stuff that's basically improved the bandwidth. And obviously, one of the big things here, again, is the L0 and L1 caches. Now, according to the documentation, this is mostly to accommodate the improvements in ray tracing performance. Again, as I said earlier, it's a 2 to 4 times increase. This seems to ultimately be the main focus of the PS5 Pro. Ray tracing, as well as the new upsampling technology that I've gone through before, so I'm not going to cover again too much in this video, but ultimately this is really cool. I think it's a good indication really of what Sony are going to be doing in the future. Obviously there is that advanced machine learning technology that's kind of incorporated into the GPU as well, and I fully expect that Sony are going to expand upon this significantly for the PlayStation 6. Now, I also want to spend just a moment discussing the configuration of the GPU. This is going to get a little technical, but I'm not going to go super deep into this. I would highly suggest, if you are very curious about shader arrays and shader engines, you could just do a quick Google. I would recommend maybe something like the RDNA white paper from AMD, as it does pretty much go through all of this exhaustively. However, basically speaking, the GPU has 32 workgroup processors that are actually on the die, but for yield reasons, 2 of those are disabled. So that basically means that you're looking at 30 workgroup processors. So how does this actually split across the GPU? Well, it's pretty simple. We are looking at 4 shader arrays across 2 shader engines. So each SE houses 2 SAs. Now, each SA, in turn, contains 8 workgroup processors. So if you take 8, multiply that by 4, or you can do the reverse if you're, feeling devilish, then of course that you get the 32. But how does that actually work, right? Because, okay, if you've got 8, 8, 8, and 8, how does that work? Well, basically, if you just said, well, you simply just disable 1 from 2 of the things, then yeah, that's pretty much how they've done it. So the configuration is 8787. And that ultimately is basically how Sony have arrived at that. It's not a huge amount of information that perhaps many of us are going to be really interested in. It's going to be something more developers are curious about. And it is pretty cool. It's also, by the way, confirmation that Kepler L2 had this information correct. I might have also discussed it previously in a video, I honestly can't remember, but I definitely remember that Kepler had leaked that, I think it was last year. So kudos to him, full credit to him for getting that correct. As a quick aside, you can see what this looks like, somewhat anyway, on an N31, that's RDNA 3 PC die shot. There are some differences, not least of which, because of course there's a lot of changes versus the RDNA 3 implementation, but you can get a general idea of how SAs and SEs would look. And you can kind of just use your imagination. Now, I also want to mention that Sony seems to have made some changes regarding the feature set of the PS5 Pro. Now, it's going to be very interesting, honestly, because at the moment we still don't have all of how this compares to the base model console. But basically what seems to have happened here is Sony have some type of variable rate shading solution now in hardware. But additionally, there are some changes on the GPU itself in terms of how the GPU basically handles geometry. Now, this is where things get quite complicated because unfortunately Sony haven't given us the full technical breakdown of the PS5. Now, basically speaking, primitive shaders are, well, how AMD kind of handled geometry, but it never really caught on, and instead the industry moved towards mesh shaders as kind of the standard. However, there is a lot of crossover between primitive shaders and mesh shaders. It is a really complicated topic, and honestly, it was a video I was going to make like quite some time ago, and I just didn't. But what I would suggest is, if you really want to know the differences between prim and mesh, you can check out an interview. If memory serves, it was with 4Gamer. I think it was David Wang, who is a senior vice president over at AMD, and he somewhat goes over what the differences are. Now, to my understanding, however, the primitive shaders inside the PS5 were not 100% the same as AMD's. Basically, Sony had some additional features in there. I don't fully know what, but I think some of them were to do with like PSVR 2, for example. Either way, what Sony have done now with the PS5 Pro is also incorporate mesh shader support. Now, it's going to be very interesting to see how this works because, well, the APIs are also different, of course. You can't directly compare an API because this does not mean, for example, that PS5 Pro is going to run like DirectX 12 Ultimate. It basically is a feature set. For example, you can have like Vulkan, which can have mesh shader support. In fact, if you actually go back to the early history of like the RTX, I think it's RTX, yeah, it was RTX 20 Turing, they actually supported mesh shaders before Microsoft even released a DirectX API to support mesh shaders. So what they were doing in their early demos, one of the demos was like the Asteroids demo, which is, It's actually pretty cool. If you've got an NVIDIA GPU of the last several years, you can check it out yourself. You can download it. It's a free download. But basically, what that did, they were using kind of their own bespoke API based on some Vulkan stuff. And it's really cool, actually. So I don't know what the underlying APIs are and how that's changed. It's going to be interesting to see what actually is officially announced from Sony. Honestly, obviously, at the end of the day, we're talking about the hardware feature sets. It's going to be really cool. However, with that said, Microsoft are also making some really big changes to their APIs as well. And I recently put out a video discussing some of those with how they're kind of like... It's actually really cool with how they're doing some of the stuff in the future. It doesn't really benefit the Xbox Series consoles. I suspect that this is going to be more for like later consoles from Microsoft, as well as obviously the PC as well. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens on the API side for both systems. Either way, the PS5 Pro is looking to be absolutely beastly. I think it's going to be a very cool system. Of course, it depends on how much it costs. I guess the thing is, like, is the PS5 Pro worth it? Because that's a question a lot of people are already asking me. It's like, well, you know, can you, like, do you want to spend the money, is ultimately where it comes down. And that's like a very, like, dumb way to put it. It's like, well, do you want to spend money? But it really kind of is like that. It's like, if you own a PS5 and you're really invested in the Sony ecosystem and you can afford it, yes, 100%. If you don't own a PS5 and you want to play games like Grand Theft Auto 6 early, because obviously the PC port's coming later, or, you know, you're like, well, actually, I kind of like to play this, or maybe I want an easy living room experience, yeah, I'd probably go with the Pro over the base model console. However, if you're someone who just, you're pretty happy with the base model console, you don't really play too many games or whatever, then obviously that's a completely different thing. On the other hand, you could just buy the PS5 Pro and then, you know, give the base model console to your kids, or maybe to a friend who hasn't upgraded yet. So I think we'll know a lot more when Sony fully discloses stuff, but so far I think the console looks pretty cool in theory. One last thing for this video, this is going to be really quick. Finally, Nintendo have actually announced the new console. Well, sort of. They've basically said that the new console will be announced within this financial year, but that basically means it can be up until Q1 next year. There is no details. They have not stated any specifications, no release plans, nothing, nada, zilch, fuck all. The only thing, however, I would say, I personally don't think it's going to be this side of Christmas. I've spoken to a couple of people, and it seems that ultimately Nintendo are in no rush. I think they're going to wait, have as many killer apps and games as possible, and also so they're not competing against the PS5 Pro. That's just my speculation, and also some whispers I've heard in the industry. With that said, Nintendo just kind of do their own thing. I will be interested to see what the new system brings to the table. Ultimately, the hardware doesn't interest me as much as the games. So we'll have to wait and see on that one. Anyway, guys, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Take care of yourselves. Have an amazing day. Bye for now.